The next thing we're going to learn in Greek verbs is the imperfect tense form. So far we've only learnt one other tense form, the present tense form, present active indicative with luo. The imperfect is closely related to the present because they both share what's called the present stem. That's the verb stem that's used to form these verbs. And they both share the internal aspect or imperfective aspect. Remember that the imperfective aspect is the view of the action from the inside, as though it is unfolding, as though you are seeing the action take place before your eyes. Now, the key difference between the present and the imperfect tense form is that the imperfect tense form is usually past referring. That is, it's usually referring to some action in the past. That's why it's traditionally called a past tense. In actual fact, it's not always the case for the imperfect, but most of the time. And you should, as you see an imperfect, regard it as a past tense by default, unless the context indicates that something else is being communicated. Now, what we need to do is study how these verbs are formed. There are three key elements for an imperfect verb. There's an augment, there's the verb stem, and then there are the personal endings. And you may remember the example we used a little while ago, ebaptizonto. That was an imperfect tense form. Let's look at the table of imperfect verbs to see this more clearly. So let's look at this table for the imperfect active indicative. It's the imperfect tense form, active in voice, indicative in mood of our model verb luo or leo. So first I'll read these through using the Erasmian pronunciation, then I'll read them again using the modern Greek pronunciation, and then we will look at each one a little more closely. First we have eluon, elues, eluen, eluomen, eluete, eluon. Notice the accent change for these first and second plurals. The acute is above the upsilon. Now the modern Greek pronunciation. Elion, Elies, Elien, Eliomen, Eliete, Elion. Now, how do these translate? Well, the imperfect active indicative, first person singular, Elion, is translated I was loosing. So the was helps to indicate the past temporal reference, an action in the past, and the loosing helps to communicate the imperfective aspect, the internal aspect, as though it is unfolding. I was loosing. The imperfect active indicative, second person singular, is elues. You were loosing. The imperfect active indicative, third person singular, is eluen. He was loosing, she was loosing, or it was loosing. The imperfect active indicative, first person plural, is eluomen. We were loosing. The second person plural, eluete. You were loosing. The third person plural, eluon. They were loosing. Now, it's important that you study and learn these forms. There are some variations for the imperfect active indicative, just as there are some variations for the present active indicative. And those variations will only confuse you if you don't have these solidly learnt well. So study this table. You'll be able to find some patterns, some similarities with the present active indicative. But the most distinct feature for the imperfect is the presence of the augment, this epsilon that stands in front of the stem lu, lu, on. Now, speaking of this augment, there are some rules we need to learn called rules for augmentation. This affects verbs that begin their stem with a vowel. Now, luo is not one of those verbs because its stem begins with a consonant. So the epsilon simply combines with the lambda and does not change. Luon. But when we see a verb stem that begins with a vowel, such as alpha or epsilon or omicron, then when the augment is added, we see a change to the augment. And so we need to study these rules for augmentation. First, short vowels. If the verbal stem begins with the letter alpha, then when we add the epsilon augment, these two letters combine so that the augment becomes ita. Same thing happens here if the verbal stem begins with an epsilon. The epsilon plus the epsilon creates an ita. If the verbal stem begins with an omicron, the epsilon augment plus the omicron combine to create omega. Next we have diphthongs. What happens if a verbal stem begins with one of these vowel combinations known as a diphthong? If a verbal stem begins with the diphthong alpha iota, then the combination of the epsilon augment plus alpha iota turns into ita with a subscript. Notice this is the same as over here, the epsilon plus an alpha. But the iota in the diphthong has now become a iota subscript. The same thing happens with the next diphthong, epsilon iota. When the epsilon augment is combined with this diphthong, we get ita with the iota subscript. Again, the same as over here with epsilon plus epsilon, but the extra iota becomes a subscript. Again, the same thing happens here. When the verbal stem begins with the diphthong omicron iota, the epsilon augment combines with this diphthong to create an omega plus the iota subscript. If a verbal stem begins with this diphthong, alpha epsilon, the epsilon augment combines with it to create this diphthong, ita epsilon. And finally, if a verbal stem begins with the diphthong epsilon epsilon, then the epsilon augment combines with that diphthong to create either this diphthong or that diphthong, ita epsilon or epsilon epsilon. Now, that will all seem rather confusing right now. The key thing is to try to learn these rules by rote. Practice it. These are the easier ones. Start with those. They will help you to learn these diphthong rules. Unchanged are the vowels ita, iota, epsilon, and omega. If the verbal stem begins with one of these vowels, they are not changed when the augment is added to them. They remain the same.